Welcome back to the Gospel in 3D. My name is Derek Van Ruler, and I'm here to help, equip, and encourage every Christian to live every day with gospel intentionality. Currently, we are working on a multi-part series in which we are looking at reading the Bible effectively. And to do so, we have seen that there are 4 steps to the process. The first is context. We want to ensure that we understand all that goes into the backstory of a book of the Bible. The second is section. Here we want to ensure that we grasp what the section is actually about. Third is theology, where we are seeing how the section connects to or builds upon the biblical story. And that's where we're going to continue to drill down today. Now, some of the difficulty I find in grasping what happens in the Bible story is understanding the history of the Bible. Not the book itself, but the story of the book. And so today I want to briefly walk you through some of the mountaintops of the book so that you can grasp where the story has been and where it's going. So fasten your seatbelts because we're going to rapidly walk through this. So last time I spoke about how God created the world and how God created man and woman in His image. But it didn't take long before man rebelled against God. And from that point on, man has been rebelling against God. And we've been looking for the seed of the woman who can come and rescue us from our plight. And the Old Testament is full of characters who we wonder if they are the ones. A few chapters after this, we meet a man named Noah, who is told to build an ark for a massive flood at a time when people had never seen rain. And this was because God was going to destroy the earth, because the intentions of man's heart was only evil all the time. And so the Lord sent rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights and destroyed all life except what was on the ark. And after a year on the ark, Noah and his family got off, but it didn't take long before Noah failed as well by getting drunk. Fast forward again and you'll find that God chose a man named Abram. And He promised to give Abraham many descendants, bless his name, and give him a land that his descendants will inherit. There's only one problem. Abram, who would later be called Abraham, and his wife Sarai were very old, and they didn't have any kids. And so to fix the problem, Sarai tells Abram to sleep with the maid and have a kid that way. Well, that's not what God had planned, and so Abram fails to be the one that we're looking for. But God holds up His end of the bargain and gives them a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob's name is later changed to Israel because he wrestled with God. Then Israel had 12 sons, and after some time they moved down to Egypt due to a famine. Then we reach the beginning of Exodus, where we find the Israelites are in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. At this point, God sends a man named Moses to rescue the people out of slavery through 10 plagues that we talked about last time. However, Moses too fails because when the people began to grumble, Moses did not obey God. God told him to strike a rock once to get water out of it, and Moses strikes it twice out of anger. As a result, Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land. Now, there's much debate about when all of this took place, but many believed it was in 1446 BC, when the Israelites were allowed to leave Egypt and started heading towards the promised land. However, only 2 of that original generation made it, as the rest rebelled and did not trust God that He would give them the promised land. Thus, God made them wander in the desert for 40 years until that generation, except Joshua and Caleb, died. And after the death of Moses, Joshua picks up the mantle and begins to lead the people to conquer the land. Unfortunately, as the story progresses, the people fail to take possession of the full land, instead leaving the locals there to live. After some time, the locals lead the Israelites away from worshiping God to worshiping false idols. Years go by in which people do what is evil in the eyes of the Lord, culminating when they ask God to give them a king like the nations. The problem with this is that God was to be their king. And by asking for a king like the nations, they are essentially rejecting God as their king. So God gave them a king named Saul in 1050 BC, who was tall and handsome. But again, Saul fails to follow God rightly, instead fears man. Thus God rejects Saul, crowning David as king in 1025 BC. David is a great king, pointing the nation to God until one fateful day in which he commits adultery and brings havoc upon the empire. From that moment on, the empire is never the same. As time passes, Solomon, David's son, takes over the kingdom in 970 BC. He famously asks the Lord for wisdom, which God grants. From there, he's commanded to build the temple for God, where God would dwell and where the people can offer their sacrifices to God as a form of worship to him. In 959 BC, the temple is completed. Unfortunately, after the death of Solomon, the empire is divided into two: Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And both nations begin to rebel against God, following other gods rather than the one true God. Thus they send many prophets to warn them of the coming destruction, until in 722 BC, the Assyrian army comes and destroys Israel. Fortunately, God miraculously saves Judah years later. But that's not the end of the story. In 586 BC, after the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, they come and conquer the nation of Judah. Now, in both cases, opposing nations take a certain number of people back to their homeland as captives or exiles. This is the beginning of what is called the dispersion, where the people of God are dispersed. From there, in 539 BC, we see the Medes and Persians conquer the Babylonians. This allowed some of the Israelites to return to their homeland, while others were taken to Persia to work in the government there. In 536 BC, we see exiles returning to Jerusalem with the freedom to rebuild the temple. But that doesn't last long when others persuade them to stop doing that. In 520 BC, work on the temple resumes, and in 516 BC, the temple is officially completed. Then in 479 BC, Esther becomes the queen of Persia, saving her people from a Holocaust in what is now called the Feast of Purim, to celebrate this rescue. In 458 BC, we see Ezra return to Jerusalem to teach the law of God. In 444 BC, Nehemiah is sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall of the city. And then in 430 BC, the final book of the Old Testament, Malachi, is written. At this point, the Old Testament history goes silent. But history itself continues. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great of the Greeks comes and conquers Israel and the Persians. And in 323 BC, the Egyptians take control of Israel until 311 BC, when the Seleucid dynasty begins. Battles continue until 167 BC, when the abomination of desolation from the book of Daniel occurs, when Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king, comes and builds an altar to Zeus on top of the altar in the temple of God, defiling the temple. In 166 BC, the Israelites revolt and gain independence, leading to the celebration of Hanukkah. And then, after more years of war and tumult, in 63 BC, Pompey of Rome comes in and captures Israel, which would last for the next 7 centuries. And in 5 BC, Jesus Christ comes on the scene as a baby boy. So there you have it, the historical timeline of the Bible. I know that was a lot, but it is necessary if you're trying to figure out how each biblical story fits into the plot line of the Bible. So now you can understand a bit more of the background of 1 Peter and what they would have felt. Take time to think about this history and how you would have felt if you were living in this time period reading this letter. And then I will see you again next week. Until next time.